No idea. That's why I always say, please send me reminders. So thank you so much for doing that. I appreciate
No problem. Thank you again for joining us. So I will just introduce the show briefly. I'll do a
Okay.
brief bio for you, and then we'll jump straight into the questions. It
Sounds
shouldn't
good.
take up too
Yeah.
much of your time.
Remind me what we're talking about, but I'll
It's
figure
a
it out
bit
as
of
we go
a
along.
it's a bit of a mixed bag. I've just
Okay.
finished your book, Occult, Politics and the Occult, or
Oh,
Politics
okay.
of
All
the
right. Good.
Occult,
All right.
and
All right. All
I
right. Good.
enjoyed it very much.
All right.
So
Okay.
here we
Well,
go.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Let's start that again. Welcome back to the Special Access Podcast. Thank you for joining us once again. Please remember to follow, like, subscribe, and enjoy. And we're going to get straight into tonight's episode. So tonight's guest is Gary Lachman, who was born in New Jersey but has lived in London since '96. He's a founding member of the rock group Blondie, but is now a full-time writer with more than a dozen books to his name on topics ranging from evolution of consciousness and the Western esoteric tradition to literature and suicide and the history of popular culture. Lachman writes frequently for many journals in the US and UK and lectures on his work in the US, UK, and Europe. His website is garylachman.co.uk. So, Gary, this is something a bit different for our listeners today. We tend to delve more into the UFO side of things over here. But I think the things we're going to talk about tonight, and they're the things that subsequently drew me to the UFO field. I feel it's equally worth exploring the world of esotericism as it is the world of ufology. Personally, I believe it's all part and parcel of the same phenomena, and I would like your opinion on that belief. But do you believe that there is an all-encompassing phenomena, and could there be a unified theory of high strangeness?
Well, I mean, yeah, it could be. It could be. I think quite a few people over the years have, offered some candidates for that. I don't know if anyone's really secured one that's all embracing and everyone agrees with. But I mean, much like you said, Einstein was looking for a unified field theory in physics, never quite got one. But I mean, certainly all these things overlap. So if, someone says, what do you write about? And I said the occult. I mean, it depends who you're talking to. I mean, if you're just talking to the average person, generally it does mean UFOs and witchcraft and Satanists and whatever. But if you're talking to somebody who's, more of an aficionado or cognoscenti about it, then, oh, well, what area of that? So it all depends on that kind of thing. I mean, but in general, these things, in some sense do overlap, I think, at least the UFO phenomena and the paranormal sort of side have blended in over the years, at least, from what I understand, less nuts and bolts ideas about what UFOs are, and more along Jacques Vallée, that sort of realm where, the same phenomena seems to have happened back in history. And what we can understand is kind of, spirits or a variety of different sorts of things that happened in the past, but they take on the form of the contemporary culture. So for us, it was, these kind of actual, vehicles in the sky and so on and so on. But I mean, it's one of these things I've been aware of peripherally. I mean, I know people who work in that area, the UFO area. A friend of mine, Mark Pilkington, did a book and a film called Mirage Men.
Yes,
but,
I know.
My understanding, he's more like, oh yeah, it's happening, but it's actually a government kind of, or whatever, some kind of cover-up sort of thing. So, but I would say, yeah, it does seem to be. But I mean, who is it? Jeffrey Kripal, if you know his work.
Do.
He's an American scholar and mutants and mystics, but he's had UFO experiences, and he relates them to his own sort of spiritual quest and to comic books and all of that. So yeah, I mean, it's we do live in this kind of crossover time, right? Isn't that kind of like a post everything sort of way of looking at things, where you just kind of mix and match sort of stuff, and all this stuff kind of blends. If it doesn't immediately, by the time you finish writing your book, they do. They kind of do blend together. So I'm all for that. It's sort of a creative way to deal with all this material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Gary, you're a very level-headed writer. Your book, Politics and the Occult, talks about the prevalence of the occult within the circles of power through history, but without any outlandish theorizing. But what drew you to write and research the occult and mysticism in the first place?
Well, for that particular book about politics, or just in general? I mean,
Just in general.
In general, I mean, I got interested in all this sort of stuff ages ago when I was a musician. When I was playing in, well, Blondie, who at the time, weren't known. We were part of this whole, relatively unknown or soon to be a little bit less unknown scene in New York in the mid '70s. And I mean, the story, is that where I was living at the time, we had this loft space on the Bowery, which if you go to New York today and you go to the Bowery, you couldn't afford to go in any of the restaurants. I mean, I certainly would have. And anybody who lived there back in the day would not have been able to get into anywhere on the Bowery now. But back then, it was just, Skid Row. It was, the end of the line. That's why we could afford to live there. And we lived in this loft space. Any case, Chris and Debbie, they the singer and guitarist in the band, they were interested in all this kind of stuff. Yeah, there we go. There we are. Yeah, there I am without my glasses on.
On the right-hand side.
Yeah. They had a kind of kitschy interest in the occult, and also somebody else who the fellow who rented us the floor we lived on, he was this wild, flamboyant artist guy, and he was into Aleister Crowley, and he had Crowley's tarot deck, and all this kind of stuff was around in the background. And I never had any real serious interest in any of that. Or the only interest I had was, say, through horror fiction or the horror films in the 30s and 40s, that kind of thing.
Yeah, same.
Like all this debris was around, and I just started picking up on it. And I read a couple books, and this book was just called The Occult, and it's by a British writer named Condom Wilson. And it just really hit me. It was so well written. And he looked at it in terms of kind of philosophy and psychology and history and literature and all that. It wasn't just a book of spells and ghost stories and stuff like that. It was like, oh, this is a whole, kind of history of this weird stuff that called the occult, that actually he was making it make a lot of sense and so on. So I basically got just fascinated with it from then and just started reading. So that happened a long time ago. But it wasn't until about the early 90s that I started sort of writing book reviews and articles about all this kind of stuff. So there was a long period where I was in the rock world for quite some time, and that's what I did. And actually one song I wrote when I was in Blondie called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence Here." It's about paranormal experiences like telepathy and shared dreaming that my girlfriend at the time, we were experiencing that. So it was productive in that way then, but it wasn't until sometime later on that I started writing about it.
Excuse me. So I normally ask our guests at the top of the show, have they ever seen a UFO? But in your case, I want to ask you, is magic real?
Well, I guess the bad answer is, well, it depends what you mean by magic and what you mean by real. But put it this way, I have a book coming out in January. Here's the unashamed plug. It's called Dreaming Ahead of Time. And it's about, there you go, experiences with precognitive dreams, synchronicity, and coincidence. And in my book, which I assume we'll get on to talking about it because you've mentioned occult and politics, Dark Star Rising, which is about, who. I give a definition of magic in there as being induced synchronicity. So what does that mean? Wow. Well, synchronicity in the first place is a name that the psychologist C.G. Jung in the last century gave to what we would call meaningful coincidence. So, there's some coincidences you have that are just really weird, but they don't necessarily have a particular meaning for you. But then there's other ones that seem like somebody wrote this into the script somehow. This is someone knew what was going on in your life, in your head, and suddenly right in front of you was some message about that could not have, in any way just, happened. You know what I mean? So synchronicity is something like that. And I say that in a way you can say magic is a way if you make those happen somehow. And I'll go out on a limb and I say I think that's possible because in the first place, I accept that they do happen in the first place. Whether it always works, whether any body has it nailed in some particular system, do this and that I can't say. But just, you know, if you find yourself out on the fringes of kind of consciousness and in these, you know, other strange states, they do seem to extend out into what we call the world, and they do seem to have some kind of effect. So is it reliable? No. But does it ever happen? I'll have to say I'll come down on yes.
And so you rely heavily on the theory of synchronicities for your definition of magic. But so if the frequency and power of your synchronicities increase depending on the topic, does the power of your synchronicity increase depending on the topic you may be studying at the time?
On the topic? Well, they certainly seem to increase if what you're studying is synchronicity itself. I mean, there's all these stories. I mean, I retell them, and I mean, they happen to me. We all have them. If you're somebody who pays attention to this, you know, these times when they kind of, it's like one of those kind of firecracker, you know, strings where you light one and pop, 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 pop. You know, some of the others go off as well, and it's sort of like that sometimes. And the stories, I mean, people I write about in this book, I'm talking about my own experience, but I also, you know, draw on and talk about some others. People like Arthur Koestler, who nobody reads anymore, but he was a well-known writer of the last century, and he wrote a book called The Roots of Coincidence, where he went into all this kind of thing. And he said when he was getting material for that, and he was, you know, all these coincidences happened at the same time as he was, you know, and he coined a particular kind of coincidence, the library angel, which was if you're someone like myself and him and Condom Wilson and other people who research things and you know, go to libraries, or nowadays I guess it's look up on Google. I mean, I don't. That's a different kind of thing now. I don't know about that. I'll have to look into it. I don't know if the same sort of coincidences that we call the library angel, which is basically you're in some place, and I mean the foundation story. There's a writer named Rebecca West. Again, you know, this is old stuff, old school, and she tells a story where she was in. There's a place called the London Library here, and she wanted to get transcripts for the Nuremberg trials, basically. And for she was looking up some particular, you know, case, but for some reason, the way they were all, you know, organized, it just was in some ridiculous way that you could never find anything in particular. And so she was basically complaining or talking to, you know, the librarian, and she said, well, I don't know, you know, I've looked over here for hours, and for all I know, they could be in any one of these. And she went like that, and grabbed it and pulled it and opened it up, and there it was.
Yeah.
The very thing she was looking for was just there. It's like, oh, library angel. So
Gary,
so
do you see that as like a glitch in the matrix when you actually notice a synchronicity? Do you think
I mean, but you know, yeah, I mean, that's a contemporary sort of metaphor. Yeah, sure, you know, but yeah, it's how does that happen? I mean, you have to, okay, and you know, that opens up that whole, whatever you want to call it, Pandora's box or rabbit hole. Yeah, it's I don't know if it's a glitch in the matrix. I think it's more, I don't know what to say.
Aware of the matrix.
I always think of it, I mean, to me, I call it the guardian angel effect, in the sense like it's a tap on the shoulder, basically, sort of, you know, you're not in this alone. Kind of. So I take it in that way. So
are you actually an experiencer?
I have this, the library angel. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean,
sorry. Are you an experiencer?
I don't know what that means.
It means on the UFO side of the topic, an experiencer is somebody who's had a lot of contacts, who's seen things, who's had close experience, and
not
changed them.
Not UFOs, but in this book, the paranormal, I guess, experience that I've had the most of and have the most evidence for is precognitive dreams and related phenomena like synchronicity. So I haven't had a UFO experience. I have to say I haven't had a major kind of, you know, transformative experience like that, and I'm a little jealous of all you guys who have.
I haven't either.
It's not over yet.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm learning about, in a broader thing. So in a kind of way, I'm approaching it. Well, in a way, I think this is what needs to be done in a certain way. So I started out as an enthusiastic kind of just, I'm totally into this, stuff. And I started reading it back in 1975. And then that gradually became over time, just because I was interested in it. I just, I learned about its history and all this sort of stuff. And so you go from, the immediate kind of enthusiastic, indiscriminate reading of everything to do for a few years. But it wasn't like some intent, okay, I'm like, pursuing this in some scholarly way. No, it just was my interest and it broadened. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in the kind of language I use in some of my books, I sort of had a right brain, immediate kind of, yes, I'm interested in this stuff. And then I slogged away over many years through a left brain kind of way of just like assimilating all of it in terms of, like you said, I'm level headed. And okay, reading it up and trying to do this kind of thing too.
Yeah.
So that I'm convinced by the sort of bits that I've experienced, which I talk about in this book, Dreaming Ahead of Time, plus, the enormous amount of material that's been recorded and reported by other people. About UFOs as well. I mean, again, it's something like the book. I'm a big reader of Condom Wilson. I've said this already, and he did a book called Alien Dawn, which was just basically him on UFOs. He's not really a UFO sort of writer, but he's somebody who they commissioned him to write a book about UFOs, and he read everything he possibly could for a year, and then sat down and write it. So he covers a lot of ground, but he brought together a lot of what I said earlier about this notion of it being something to do with consciousness in some way. There's this great novel called Miracle Visitor, I think it was called. Ian Watson, a science fiction writer, where it's in a fictional form, but it's about contactees, but in the context of them having strange altered states and, weird kind of phenomena happening around them, and having to do with sort of esoteric, and they're tying in kind of Sufi mysticism in this book as well. So, but in any case, I mean, from that angle, I can see, and this is like Jung. Jung is like one of the early ones talking about this, right, with his book UFOs. A report on things seen in the sky. In the late 1950s. So from that angle, I find it interesting. I haven't had time to really go into it yet. Maybe somebody will ask me to write a book about it.
I'd just like to point out for our UFO audience that the first time I encountered the term library angel was in Diana Pasalka's American Cosmic, which was a big hit amongst the UFO crowd. So just as an aside. So I've heard you've mentioned Condom Wilson now a couple of times. I've read you are a self-described Wilsonian. What does that mean?
Well, somebody who's read his books and has been influenced by him. If you know his work, he's written, well, depending on what you consider a book, certainly more than 100 books, and somewhere close to 200. He died in 2013. His most famous book, the first book he wrote, the first book got published, The Outsider, back in the 50s, which was became a sort of a beat kind of, or a British existential beat kind of counterculture book about alienation and creativity. And then he later in the early 70s kind of reinvented himself as a writer on the occult. And he wrote this book, The Occult. And then he went on to write quite a few others about a variety of different occult paranormal phenomena, but also about consciousness. And then backed up by all this stuff that he had written in sort of from the mid 50s through the 60s about existentialism and phenomenology and philosophy and psychology and all that. So it was grounded in a kind of interesting, at least, kind of philosophical kind of background. And I wound up meeting him, and I guess we became friends. I mean, lots of people visited him. He lived in Cornwall. Down at the very, tip almost, in a little place called Gorin Haven, which is next to Mevagissey, which is even, it's not a big place itself. So way down that end. And I visited him a long time ago. And then over the years, even when I lived in California, he came and stayed at a place when I was house sitting there in the Hollywood Hills, and then when I lived in London, I've gone down and he's come up in a variety of things, and I've reviewed books of his for The Independent and The Guardian and all that. But he died in 2013, and then I wrote a book about him and all of his work and bring it all together, because he wrote all these different sorts of things, and he wrote novels and crime novels and science fiction and espionage, and then all these books again about philosophy and psychology and all that. But they're all about one, this particular thing that he talks about is this notion of the robot, in the sense that there's something wrong with human consciousness, and what it is that we have this kind of evolutionary labor-saving device that we've developed in order to basically deal with the world. But the problem is it does its job too well. So it's the thing that, when you learn how to type, or you learn how to ride a bike or drive a car or whatever, when you first start to do it, you have to pay attention to every little thing. You have to pay attention to every little key you're striking. And then, one day you can just do it and you can think about what you want to write, right? So you are up another level. And so at a lower level, it's through your hands, but you, conscious you're not doing it. You pass that over to the robot. Handy thing to have. But the problem is it starts doing everything, for us, and we start to feel like we're not alive. And Wilson sort of analyze that phenomena and develop different ways and different ideas about how to sort of, become more alive yourself, and not to have the robot living all the time for you.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. And it brings to mind, you mentioned the term guardian angel already, but that higher aspect of consciousness, I think to myself as a guardian angel, holy guardian angel, for want of a bit of a hokey word there, but yes, I agree. So you mentioned, sorry, I'm going to skip ahead here. You mentioned Condom Wilson in relation to espionage here. I noticed in your book that espionage is a term, it comes up again and again. John Dee, Gurdjieff, Blavatsky, Fleming, Crowley, all in one way or another have been associated with the world of espionage. What's with the why is there a prevalence of the occult in this world?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, it is. I mean, it turns up in a variety of different ways. Let's say, you said Dee. Dee was, involved in the whole idea of the British Empire and all that, and he was involved in, Queen Elizabeth's sort of intelligence sort of service at the time. But then with other people, it's something that gets slapped onto them and they're accused of. But right. The whole idea, say Blavatsky, this was the thing that she was most indignant about when famously she was investigated by Society of Psychical Research in India, although she wasn't sort of there at the time, herself. She wasn't on the premises when they sent their man there. But in his report, where he basically was saying, she was a fraud, but the thing that she was most incensed about was when he claimed that she was a spy, and she was, absolutely indignant about this and all this. But I guess in that sense, it's because in that milieu, seances or the kind of thing where one assumes from the mainstream point of view that anyone who gets involved in that is credulous, they may reveal sorts of things in that context that someone who's, privy to that intelligence could pass on. Or say in Gurdjieff's case, he even says that in his early career, in order to travel to places and get finance to travel, he associated himself with certain sort of nationalist movements in Central Asia or around at that time. And then, he was around at the time of the Great Game, this chess game between Russia and Great Britain in Tibet and all of that area too. And, so, in order to move around in places, in order to have access to places, doing, that kind of work, whatever that might have been. It may have even just been carrying documents, whatever, and all that. So, but again, at the same time, there's been made a lot of claims about it. Like, Crowley's claims to have been really working for British intelligence when he was in the United States in World War I, writing pro-German propaganda that in many ways, yes, it's absolutely ludicrous what he wrote. Is, you know, if you read it today, it's like, my God, it's what a hoot. You know, I mean, no wonder that the Germans didn't think, you know, was ist das? You know, I mean, I'm surprised they couldn't. That's what he said. It's like, yes, I was writing things so ridiculous that there would be a complete, you know, it would work against their war effort and all that. But, you know, there's no evidence for that. But it's fun. But I'll tell you, one of the things that, you know, that was that Richard Spence, I think, wrote that book. I mean, I don't know if he's the one who's responsible. What is it, Secret Agent 666 or something?
Yeah,
like that.
something like that. Yeah.
But if you go to London here, if you go to the National Portrait Gallery, unless they've taken it down, last time I was there is a portrait of Crowley in there. The National Portrait Gallery is the best and brightest of, you know, Britain. There's a portrait of Crowley. It's this portrait of. It was on the cover of one of the Equinoxes, where he's in this kind of Tibetan robe, and he's in a mudra sort of thing, and the forelock, and I sort of don't know.
I found a picture of my great-great-grandfather the other day, and he was the chief of police in Alexandria in Egypt, and he's there with a fez on, sat on a camel in front of the Great Pyramids. You know,
those were the days.
Those are the days.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And but the thing is, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, he was British intelligence. He is the original James Bond, from what I can gather.
Right. Yeah. But if you go to the National Portrait Gallery and you read on the little plaque down there, they say he was a poet and a mountaineer and a spy, and the bottom he had an interest in the occult or something like that. You know, so it's kind of like they've reinvented him, or, you know, but they sort of accept the idea that he was, you know, doing that. So I don't know. I mean, as far as I know, there hasn't been any hard evidence to prove, you know, that he was. But I mean, but there is this crossover, you know, throughout history of sort of occult and politics. I mean, and not necessarily in any kind of conspiracy theory sort of ways. I mean, basically, if you just do your homework and read up on things and see, and not only on the side of the right, which is where usually it's assumed that there is a kind of progressive kind of occult politics as well.
That's actually
one of the reasons why I wrote, you know, Politics in the Occult.
It's actually a question I have for you. Historically, are occult or mystical beliefs more prevalent on the right or the left, in your opinion? And maybe what about today? Is it different?
Well, I mean, you know, as I say, in some ways you want to say it's just there. But traditionally, at least in terms of modern times, and talking about traditional modern times means going back, say, to the French Revolution, that's where you consider sort of the beginning of the secular age in many ways. You know, the moderns were against religion. Well, you know, a century or so later, maybe a little bit less, you know, you have Marx, you know, religion is the opium of the people. So the whole modern kind of idea it tends to be materialist, in the sense that it's about science and it's about reason and, you know, all of that. Not traditional in the way that tradition is associated with religion. It's the supernatural and the mystical and all that kind of thing. And the right, politically right, tends to be associated with that, with the, you know, tradition, that side. So just broadly in that sense. But if you look, as I say, like you can find ample evidence of, you know, people on the progressive side being interested in occult, you know, stuff, and also in some way employing that or having that being part of their ticket. I mean, the one classic case is Victoria Woodhull, who was the first woman to run for president. Obviously, she didn't win, but in America in 1872. But she was a faith healer, a mesmerist, a free love advocate, and she also published, I think, the first English translation in the United States of, you know, the Communist Manifesto. But she also had a brokerage firm in Wall Street. And one of her and one of the reasons she had that is that one of her clients was Cornelius Vanderbilt, who, you know, at the time was one of the richest men in the world, I think, well, not only America. So there's all this kind of thing, and she didn't win, and she was branded Mrs. Satan because of her interest in all these wild progressive things like free love and socialism, but also mesmerism and faith healing, and you know, animal magnetism, and going, you know, into having visions and things of that sort. Which you know, all that kind of stuff spread across America in different ways. It's this alternative history that it turns up on the History Channel with the woo 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 kind of music and the click cuts and all that. But it actually, you know, it just was there. It's just like with, you know, it's like people today, you know, in many ways. Not, you know, exactly the same, but you know, it's all domesticated today. You go to your New Age bookshop or health and well-being center or whatever it is, and you know, many of the things that, you know, were considered, you know, wild and radical, but you know, are available, you know, now. And again, it's say the 1960s, you know, which is all left and progressive and all that. But the famous March on Washington in 1966 or 7, I forget now, a year or two out there, anti-Vietnam War march. You had Kenneth Anger, who's the avant-garde filmmaker, who's a devotee of Aleister Crowley, and Ed Sanders, who was from the band The Fugs. And the Fugs get their name from Norman Mailer's novel The Naked and the Dead, because he couldn't say F-U ...
Yeah.
So he said Fug instead. So fugging hell, or get the fug out. So they were the Fugs, and they were this real radical, you know, 60s political rock band and all that. And they were on a flatbed truck in front of the pentagram, shouting "Out, demons, out!" and trying to exorcise the Pentagon. And they also wanted to try to levitate it.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, they had to encircle it. And the guards there said, "Well, look, you can try to levitate it, but no, you cannot encircle the Pentagon."
Yeah.
No, levitate away. But I'm saying this was, you know, and it's what is it, Armies of the Night? I'm trying to remember if that's a Norman Mailer book where he gives an account of this, and it's this wild, radical, all these witches. It's all dark, black, you know, strange kind of stuff, and that, you know, that segues quite easily over into the yippie, absurdist kind of politics, where, you know, you walk on red lights and stand still at green ones on purpose, and you know what I mean, all the kind of counter, you know, because so much of black magic is just like reverse of things, you know, it's the crosses upside down and all that kind of stuff. So that's one of the things I took from my first book called Turn Off Your Mind, which is about the 1960s, about how the whole entire popular culture of the 60s was saturated with occult kind of ideas. It just was the most popular thing around, but and even into this kind of radical politics.
Mm-hmm. Right, and even we got this new Beatles documentary coming out at the end of this month, and famously they've got Crowley, Young. Who else is on Sgt. Pepper's? I know there's a good list of people. Huxley, yeah.
And there's a couple Swamis.
It's a good bunch of people.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, really? Okay. So I didn't know that. So this is where is this? Where's this documentary?
I'm not sure where it's coming out. It's Peter Jackson directed it, so it's a pretty big deal. I think it's on Disney, actually. Yeah, it's a 3-part thing coming out on the 25th about the making of Let It Be.
Let's hope they talk about John Lennon's UFO experience as well. Then, because he had a major UFO experience. Yeah.
Well, was that when he was taking, you know, acid every day? Or?
Yeah, I don't
Probably.
know. Yeah.
Was that when he had turned off his mind?
It was natural DMT release, I think.
Yeah.
Right, okay. No, I haven't heard about this, but Let It Be I haven't seen it in years. I remember I saw it when I was, you know, teenage. Wow, no, but I imagine watching it now is probably very, very different. So,
I've never actually seen it. I think he's just taken all of the old B stock from it and comprised a new documentary showing the inner turmoil going on at the end.
Oh yeah, I mean, everybody hates everybody in that. I mean, all this kind of around. Come on, boys, go on, chaps.
George quits at one point.
Yeah. He says, I'll play it like this or play it like that, or I won't play it at all. No, I mean, it was like, and everybody hits Yoko.
I'm sorry to go way off topic here, but I actually read a news article the other day about a correspondence between John Lennon and Ringo regarding how good Blondie were. Are you aware of that? Yeah,
I never heard that. Really?
Huh. Yeah, they used to send postcards back and forth to each other after the Beatles split, and Lennon said to Ringo, "I think you should check out this band Blondie. I think they're really." I'm paraphrasing here. I think they're really going in the direction you should think about, or something.
Wow. You have to send me wherever.
I will.
That, because I mean, he was in New York at the time, but I never caught wind that he had come down to CBGB or anything like that. But actually, I mean, well, I'll reminisce here a little bit. I mean, after he gets killed, I did a John Lennon a memorial concert with Jimmy Destry, one of the guys from Blondie, well, the keyboardist, and some other people on the scene. We played at this place called Hurrah in Uptown. It was one of the clubs at the time. And so I sang Instant Karma and Cold Turkey.
Oh, cool.
Sadly, there's no recording of it, but I never heard that. So send me a link to that.
I'll send that on afterwards, after this. Yeah. So back to John Dee for a minute. I think John Dee is a pretty important figure, both exo and esoteric wise in our society. For me, he's a great example of occult influence in our lives, like such as coining the term British Empire. He's the original 007. And yes, these beliefs were spawned in a time when they were common, but the influence lives on in some of the more shadier aspects of our century, such as the MI5. But I'm thinking more of his Enochian angel work, its influence on Crowley, and therefore Jack Parsons, JPL, and then NASA.
Well, I mean, well,
it's a lot there.
It's just, it's quite a bit there. For your listeners or viewers who don't know, Enochian comes from these experiments with what was called scrying, that Dee and his scryer, this fellow named Edward Kelly, who was a rather dubious character. Scrying was, he looked, this was the idea of looking into the crystal ball, and there's something called the show stone. And Dee himself wasn't very good at that kind of thing, because he was, pop psychology, he was more left brain. He's very, he's a mathematician. He was very much, particular, persnickety. In many ways, like these guys were then. Newton is like this too. They're like very, very neurotic and like, fastidious and this kind of thing. And they want to get it right, but they need somebody like Kelly to kind of get the unconscious going and get the visions and all that. So Kelly would look into this thing, and it's in the British Museum here in London.
The obsidian.
His mirror, his magic mirror, this obsidian kind of mirror. So it wasn't a crystal ball, but it was this obsidian mirror sort of thing. So
are we calling this remote viewing now? Is this basically the same thing?
That's a good
question. It all depends. Well, not so much, because remote viewing and clairvoyance is about this plane. I can, without the miracle of the internet, I can see into whatever, the Bank of England, I can right now, which is a physical place, down the road from me. But what Dee is doing, he's not doing that. He's talking to angels. And it's in the context of a whole cosmology. It's in within the whole ontology, a whole cosmology, a hierarchy of being that the whole essence of modernity is it's nothing like that. It's all the same. It's all flat line, horizontal. It's all physical, and all this supernatural stuff with different dimensions of higher being. That's just rubbish. And that's his whole history. That's related to the Hermetic tradition and all that, which Dee was smack dab in the middle of. At the same time, he's one of these people who's crossover, because he was very aware of what, mathematics and the rising, rational sciences and all that sort of stuff. So he, knew all that kind of stuff and applied it, also in ways, the geography and a variety of other kinds of ways. And again, all that kind of stuff at the time was suspect. I mean, Dee was with Elizabeth, he was in high favor, and then he fell out of favor. And then people were freaked out, just like almost like the satanic panic of the 1980s. They were freaked out about anything to do with magic at a certain point, and a book of just mathematics, just because of its figures and numbers. They were scared of it, and they burned it. So there a time, you know, where there were piles and piles of books. Some of them might have had to do with, you know, the Hermetic sciences. It wasn't woo-woo, you know, X-Files stuff for those people then. This was a whole tradition of science and another body of knowledge that, you know, was in competition, well, both with the church and with the rising natural sciences. But, I mean, and so Dee was kind of in both camps, but he lost favor. And yeah, so all of that, you know, became, you know, quite suspect. And then that's when it went underground. That's when it became what we today kind of think of as the occult, and who this other forbidden, you know, or rejected other kind of tradition, you know. So yeah, it's a strange thing. It didn't start out the way that, you know, we understand it today.
Do you think that the good people at NASA have many occult beliefs in their cult corridor?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry. I realized we got off the whole kind of thing.
No, that's fine.
No, we did. I mean, I was trying to remember, you know, had what I got onto D, and I'm trying to get back to it.
It's my own fault.
No, it's my fault. I mean, I realized now, but the Enochian, and this was this whole thing about the showstone. When Kelly would look into it, an angel would appear, you know, like it would basically have this strange alphabet, you know.
Can I just ask you first of all, Gary? Was he actually a religious man? Did he have a belief in religion anyway? Is that why he
all these people believed in God. They were very good Christians.
Yeah, that
was the world they lived in. You know, it was like, but that's what he wanted. Just like, what's his name? You know, Stephen Hawkins. You know, know the mind of God. Well, that's what Dee wanted to know the mind of God, but not through, you know, physics, elementary particles. It was through actually communicating with the angelic realms. So it was accepted that, you know, above this material plane, there were higher dimensions of being, and by communicating with that realm through Kelly was the medium, basically, you know, the medium. He was able to, you know, see. He saw the visions. So, and what he saw was the angel pointing to these different sort of strange letters on this board, and this became this alphabet. And Enoch is a figure in the Bible. He's kind of the equivalent of Hermes, which is the god of magic. So he's this, you know, almost apocryphal kind of biblical figure. I think there's something called the Book of Enoch that I think contemporary, you know, biblical scholars don't consider, you know, part of the real Bible. But in any case, that's why it's called Enochian. And so by using these keys, that's what they called them, you were supposed to be able to, through certain rituals, open up other portals into other dimensions. And Crowley, Aleister Crowley, the famous, you know, dark magician of the last century, he performed a series of Enochian workings in North Africa, a place called Buusada. Victor Neuberg, who was this poet who basically became his kind of weird magic slave. You know, they had this weird S&M relationship. But he performed all these weird, you know, things Enochian in the desert and all that. And there's a whole account of it that's in a book called Vision of the Voice. But then, you know, this is a tradition in the whole Crowley magical tradition, and also in the Golden Dawn tradition. Then you mentioned Jack Parson, and he was using this contact, you know, Babylon, you know, and who knows if he didn't or not.
Yeah, well,
things don't always appear exactly the same way you may want them to. I mean, I you know, I'm not trying to make light of it, but you know, who knows?
Mm-hmm. And so what about Crowley? What impact do you think he's had on our modern age? I know Crowley drew possibly the first depiction of a grey alien, Lamb. Could you describe that encounter for us at all?
Well, Crowley was always encountering, you know, these different entities on different planes, and mostly through using drugs and having very vigorous sex. and with a medium, which is usually a woman in that case. And I have to say right now, top of my head, I don't remember exactly whom his partner was at the time. But there were, a variety of, I mean, the most famous one is I Was. That character was more like a Fu Manchu sort of weird figure with a goatee. But Lam had this, had that alien, the gray kind of teardrop head, and the thin sort of eyes and all that. And this was supposed to be a Tibetan monk or yogi of some kind, if I'm not mistaken. I'm at the top of I'm sorry, I'm mixing them up in my head right now. But
that's fine. So you mentioned actually Tibet. I've got a couple of questions about Tibet. Your book talks about Herman Wirth, he believed that the Grail legend was linked to the Cathars, and he was one of the co-founders of the Ananurba. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. And the Ananurba were tasked with uncovering German ancestral heritage, and this is the affair that the film 7 Years in Tibet with Brad Pitt is based on. What exactly were the Nazis looking for in Tibet?
Well, they wanted to find the source of the Aryan race, basically. I mean, there's a whole, there's quite a few accounts of I didn't realize you were going to talk about that. I forget his name, but there was the famous German archaeologist who was sent there. Well, Himmler, it was Himmler who sent him, but I can't remember his name. Like, there was a very legitimate archaeologist.
Yeah, I wrote it down.
And is that Himmler's Crusade? I think is the name of the book, maybe. Yeah. Or something like that, where he's sent to Tibet to do all this kind of archaeology, dig in, also to take measurements of the local Tibetans. Because there's this whole idea but that Aryan, that was how the Aryans came from. The Aryan meant noble. The Aryans came from the north, and they were this other race who came down into southern India, and they basically, the Dravidians, who were the southern Indians, they basically took over more or less. But they were I don't know. I guess the idea was they were taller and whatever was considered nobler at the time, and that's I believe the term was coined by Max Muller. Who's one of the translator, or one of the editor of all the translations of this fantastic collection called the Sacred Books of the East. That was late 19th, early 20th century. I'm maybe getting my dates a bit mixed up here, but so I mean that's what. So the whole idea that all these Aryans, there was like really hopped up about this idea. They wanted to find the source of it, and so they were all sent out there for that. I mean, this was tied in, sadly, with some of the kind of stuff that Madame Blavatsky was talking about, but that had got picked up by these guys in Austria, the Ariosophists in Vienna, who, this whole notion of different root races and this kind of thing, which in many ways is a small part of what Blavatsky was talking about in Secret Doctrine and all that. They kind of picked up on it and, used it for their own dubious purposes. And so that, again, this whole idea of somehow showing that, the German or the Nordic, the Aryan race, is superior, stock.
Do you think the Vril Society actually existed as claimed by Powell and Berger?
No, they made up a hell of a lot of stuff. It's a fun read. I mean,
it really is.
The Morning Magicians is one of these books. Someone I know, he said it's one of these junk books that change your life.
Yeah.
So it's
I thought it was real.
There's no evidence. I mean, and it's interesting just if you know Bo Lytton's book, Vril, the Power of the Coming Race, the Vril it's the women. It's a matriarchy. The women are stronger than the men. The women, are more powerful, and they're in control. And the American who finds himself, down in the subterranean world, he's somehow, I guess because he's strange and different, he's attracted to one of the women there, and so they she talks to him and tells him everything about what's going on and all that. But I'm one of these things. I'm surprised. I don't know if feminists have picked up on it. Just like
Yeah.
Feminists haven't picked up on Madame Blavatsky, who was doing remarkable things in the 19th century. I mean, forget that women weren't even doing them. Many men weren't even doing them. But because of the occult stain, that must be it. And perhaps it's best for both of them that they haven't been picked up on them.
Are you aware of or are you familiar with the work of Peter Lavender?
I have to say, I just know his name, and
Yeah.
I see on web searches where we tend to get kind of to my detriment. I have to say I'm not familiar with his work. So
it's when you said junk books that change your life, that's Peter Lavender for me.
I'll leave that as your opinion.
But he writes a lot about Nazi occultism.
You won't be coming on this show now
ideas.
after you saying that, Dave.
Oh, I before I said it, I thought to myself, I'll cut what I'm about to say right now.
This isn't live, right? So you're editing all this, right?
Yes, I'll edit this. So yeah, that's fair. So I'd like to talk a little.
There's so many books like that. The Spear of Destiny. So many. I mean, they're fun to read and all that, and you can pick up maybe, but the main kind of thing tends to be sort of not not for but they're fun to read.
The interesting thing for me with Peter Lavender, just not to dwell too long on this, is he's written so intelligently about Nazi occultism, mystical beliefs in the echelons of power, Mormonism. I could go on and on. All these mystical books, which he believes are all part of a greater body of work. But now he is working for To the Stars Academy, Tom DeLonge's ostensible UFO company.
Wow.
And I think it's strange, and I just wanted to point that out to the listeners. So your new book, Young Synchronicity and Dreams, is about young. It looks great. I'm really looking forward to it. Could you tell us a little bit about it, please?
Well, the book basically is about precognitive dreams. Dreams in which bits and pieces of the future turn up. And by that, I don't mean dreams where you wake up and I know something's going to happen. So-and-so shouldn't take that flight, or whatever it might be, or whatever, that horse is going to win the Kentucky Derby. It's that you have a dream, and if you remember it later on that day or the next day, something in the dream turns up in real life, and it's either exactly like it or close enough to have the little tingle effect. You think, I dreamt that. And I started writing my dreams down back in about 1980. And in the book, I go back into about 40 years of my dream journals from that time up into more contemporary times. Pulling out quite a few dreams in which I dreamt bits and pieces of the future. And as far as I'm concerned, this happens. And there's at least one positively, absolutely, bullseye one that I don't see how anyone can say, well, that didn't happen. But in any case, I'll wait for it to come out. But I started doing this because I read a book called Experiment with Time by a writer named J.W. Dunn. It was written in the 1920s, and Dunn wasn't an occultist or anything like that. He was an aeronautics engineer. But just by chance, he discovered that, as I did, that he dreamt bits and pieces of the future. And he started writing down his dreams, and he developed this whole theory of time and a variety of different things, which is rather complicated and actually not necessary. You don't have to accept his theory because it equals seriality. You don't have to accept the theory at all, but just the fact, if you do as he did and as I did, you'll see. And the impetus for actually writing the book, I did it, I guess, during the first lockdown here. So what is that? Let's say year plus or so ago. That I gave a talk in London in Brompton Cemetery, and it was part of something called the Borderlands of Sleep. So it was a series of events having to do with sort of dreams and sleep and trance states and all this kind of thing. And I gave a talk about hypnagogia, which is this in-between state between sleep and waking, which incidentally is a state in which many encounter experiences take place, or possession experiences take place, or at least in the books I've read. But it's also a state in which one can have precognitive experiences. And so I gave a talk about hypnagogia, and then I just to flesh it out a bit, I added on a couple of my experiences of precognition, and also talked about people like Dunn and some other people who investigated it. T.C. Lethbridge, not a name probably you might not be familiar with, but he wrote books about UFOs, or at least one book about the UFO phenomena, which he linked to weird ideas about future and time travel. And he was someone else who talked about this kind of future dream phenomena. And the strange thing was, I said, you too, if all you have to do is write down your dreams, and I can almost guarantee that. Okay, well, you don't remember your dreams. No, it's not that you don't dream, you don't remember them. In any case, if you want to check this, just write down your dreams and see what happens. And so the next day, when I went onto Twitter, I saw that someone had posted, OMG, exclamation point. I went to this great talk last night, and the guy said, I wrote down my dreams, blah, blah, blah. I would see that I dreamt the future. He's right. And what she said was that she had dreamt that she had picked a hedgehog up out of the street and took it out of harm's way from the cars and put it safely somewhere else. And when she went to Twitter, the first thing on her Twitter feed she saw was a post about how to protect the hedgehogs.
Wow.
Right? It's not exactly, but it's subject to what I call symbolic distortion. And so she said, it works. And so when I saw that, I thought, okay, that's a sign. So I talked to my publisher and I said, would you be interested in the book about this? So that's what I've done. So it's basically, how does it happen? I have no idea. I mean, there's a book by a fellow named Eric Wargo called Time Loops, where he talks about, the Minkowski, time-space block universe where, past and future and all that is just an illusion, all that kind of thing. But I mean, that's fine and dandy, or people talk about quantum this or that somehow being responsible, but that's fine. But in the end, I don't see how you get from any particular elementary particle to this strange kind of feeling I get when I realize that, oh my God, I dreamt this, earlier, last night, and here it is right now. How does that happen? How did my mind jump the queue in the dream and presented that?
Is it your own personal? Are you dreaming about your own? What's going to happen for you, or are you dreaming about international events? Or
no. Well, this is the thing. This is what Dunn discovered as well. It's always about what your own personal. So it's about what you will read in the newspaper. It's about what you will see on television. That's what it's about. So it isn't about broad. You're not lifted up and you see a broad kind of landscape of future. It's about This is part of your kind of film strip, as it were. This is what Lethbridge would have said. It's like a film strip that somehow bits of it come up in advance in some way. I mean, there's all different metaphors you can use to try to sort of give a picture. We can grab a hold of what happens, but it defies logic, I mean, all of our mechanistic cause and effect logic just seems you can't account for this in any way. That's why, whatever you want to call it, mainstream, reductionist, whatever you want to call it, pedestrian science says, well, this is just all coincidence, and anybody who thinks otherwise, they're just credulous. But I have 40 years of evidence of it, and the best bits are coming out in this book. And there's contemporary people like Dean Radin. I don't know, do you know Dean Radin's book?
Yeah, I
work?
do. I know his book.
This book, you talked about magic. Is magic real? I should have said, well, ask him. He says yes, because he does this book called Real Magic, where he shows there's statistical evidence that if it was about anything other than the so-called wacky paranormal phenomena it's related to, would be accepted, As Condom Wilson said ages ago, the evidence for the paranormal is so overwhelming that if it was about albino rats, or, alpha particles, people would have accepted it ages ago. It's just because it so defies what our baseline assumptions are about reality that we don't know what to make of it. And to tell you the truth, I mean, every time I think any one of these things is like, it's an incredible kind of conundrum, and we should be stopped in our tracks by it. But we have this, amazing ability to get used to everything. It's the robot. It's the robot we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, there is a stigma that comes attached to occult and mystical beliefs. But if we look at something like John mentioned earlier, the remote viewing program conducted by the American government, that certainly hints to me at the knowledge of a far bigger and stranger reality than we're being led to believe.
Are you suggesting that the powers that be, know about this broader reality? But it could be. I don't know. I mean, how would you ever find out? I mean, that's why I stay shy of that, because it's just a series of trapdoors. You open one and then you start falling through all of them. So, but I don't know. It could be. I mean, this is, in fact, Dean Radin said something like that to me when we did this. It was I don't know what it was, a weekend sort of seminar a couple of years back before COVID at the Omega Studios in upstate New York about this idea of real magic. And, I said, I forget how we got onto it, but it was about how like Wikipedia, and they're basically kind of, very skeptical about this, and they always, downplay anything like this and blah, blah, blah. And he said, maybe it's because they really do accept it, but they don't want anybody else to. And I don't know. Could be. I don't know. But I mean, all I know is that, as far as I'm concerned, the bits that I've experienced are as real as anything else. And I guess the challenge is come up with some kind of worldview that can accommodate those things without, outraging reason too much.
Gary, you say you see things in your dreams, and then these things become your reality in the future. Do you ever get the same thing when you're awake? Do you ever perceive things?
Occasionally. It's occasionally. There's one example I do give of and it even happens when I'm awake. And I was not napping exactly, but I was awake, lying on a sofa and listening to the radio. And I'm a classical music fan, and I thought, I'd like to hear Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, the Sixth Symphony. And I was about to get up to go get my CD to put it on, and I said, just wait a second, see what they play next. And lo and behold, they played Beethoven's Pastoral Sixth Symphony. So I said, okay, so it just happened like that. And another time here I was walking where I live in North London. I was walking down called Rosalind Hill, down from Hampstead Village.
Good name.
And Rupert Sheldrake lives around there.
I was just about to mention Rupert Sheldrake. That's
there
weird.
Go. Yeah,
there you go.
They surround us. They surround us. Live on air, folks. You heard it here first. So yeah, I was walking down. I was thinking, Rupert Sheldrake lives around here. Wouldn't it be funny if I bumped into him? And about 2 seconds after I said that, I looked, and coming up from the crowd, walking up the hill towards me, was Rupert Sheldrake. So I mean, is
that an argument for us manifesting our own reality? Are we manifesting our own reality?
I mean, I guess it all depends. I didn't particularly want to see him. I thought, wouldn't it be funny if? I wouldn't have minded seeing him, but it's not like something I very much wanted to, which is different. That's the library angel. Rebecca West really wanted to find out about, the stuff about the Nuremberg trial, and okay, it's yours there. This was just like, wouldn't it be funny if? So I don't know, it's maybe him coming up in some way, blah, 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 the waves of whatever you want to call it going upstream hit me and made me think, wouldn't it be funny if I saw Rupert Sheldrake? But why that would happen, I don't know. Here's one of the strangest ones I give. This is more synchronicity, I guess, precognition, but they shade into each other. Was one time when I was Yeah, this is in Camden Town here in London. And I was reading Condom Wilson's little book about Jung. And in it, he gives an account of Jung going to, gives an account of one of Jung's clients going to him because he was concerned about this woman he was considering marrying, and he wanted to know whether he should marry her or not. So Jung said, well, let's consult the I Ching, the Chinese, method of divination. And they threw the I Ching coins, and they got, the marrying maiden or something. And fundamentally, it's like, no, you shouldn't, you should not marry this woman, kind of thing. And I thought, well, gee, wouldn't it have been great if I had Jung around when I was going through my marital crisis? That would have been nice to, consult him. And just as I said that, on the bus, right there in front of me, the door opened, my ex-wife walked out. And I wasn't in the habit of seeing her or anything like that whatsoever. But just as I read that, just as I said that, it's like, so I mean, these kind of weird things happen. How did that happen? Even if you try to think logically, how could that possibly have been arranged? It's just ridiculous to think how that could have been arranged in some kind of way. So
it suggests to me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it suggests to me predeterminism somewhat.
It seems, but I'm sorry, but there are also cases when you have a precognitive dream, let's say, and it puts you on your guard. I mean, the famous one was one that the writer J.B. Priestley, again, nobody reads these days, but in the last century, he was very well known. And he wrote many plays about, time and precognition and eternal recurrence, the same things happening over and over, things of that sort. But he tells a story of a woman who dreamt that she was camping, and she had her baby, with her, and she took the baby to the creek. She was washing some things in the creek, or she wanted to wash some things in the creek. And she'd forgotten the soap, so she left the baby, it seemed to be okay, the tent wasn't too far away, back to the tent to get the soap. And when she came back, this is in the dream, the baby was in the water and it had drowned. So I forget the time, in between the dream and reality, but some point in the future, she was camping. She found herself at the creek. She wanted to wash the stuff. She had the baby. She forgot the soap, but this time around, she took the baby back with her. So you might quibble and say, oh, well, it wasn't precognitive because that really wasn't the future because the baby didn't, but she remembered the dream,
Yeah.
So had she not remembered the dream, we wouldn't have known anyway, right? She hadn't remembered the dream. But the fact that she remembered the dream somehow allowed her to change the future. So Priestley, if you know Dunn argues all this, he has this kind of serialism. So there's all these kind of infinite regressive different observers. So it just gets too complicated. And he himself realizes you have to stop somewhere. But Priestley thought we just need kind of 3 kind of levels of time. So there's the usual tick-tock, straightforward, past into the present to the future sort of time, which we're all caught up in. And there's another level of time, say level 2, where you come hovering above and you can see past and future at the same time, as it were. And it gets mixed up. So most precognitive dreams, at least the ones I know, my own, and ones that I've read about in different accounts, it's always mixed up with stuff. There are the ones that are real dramatic ones, but mostly it's noise mixed up with signal, or signal mixed up with noise in that sense. And you have to kind of pick it out. So let me just finish. But then there's another level. There's another level 3 there when you kind of can make use of seeing what you can see in the future to change it. And that's what he said. So there is a possibility where we can. It isn't totally predestined. Much of it may very well be, just like train tracks go in the same direction. But you can decide what to do while you're on the train.
Well, it's
there you go. So
some of it,
sorry to interrupt you.
Clues. Do you think?
Sorry?
Do you think some of what we're perceiving are clues for the future? As in, or there is something messing with our reality and manifesting things to make us believe. We iconize things, don't we? If we don't understand things, because we look at things in a 3D way, we iconize everything that we don't understand. That's why I said earlier about people who are religious tend to see angels and demons.
Sure. Yeah.
People who are not religious might see UFOs.
Yeah.
No. I saw.
No, I think sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I had because we're coming for this from the UFO side of things. I was thinking to myself at one time, I've never seen a triangle UFO yet. I've seen all the other shapes, and that night I saw 3 triangles. That very night,
That's what I call service.
Yeah.
Well,
is that a glitch in the Matrix?
Isn't that like the crop circle? Isn't that like the crop circle phenomena where they can't do this kind, and then lo and behold, the next next time they do, they're sort of
that's
below,
what I say.
below the telephone wires, so there's no way that somehow. No, I mean I do think it's like that. And this is what this novel by the science fiction writer Ian Watson, I think it was written back in the 80s. I think it's Miracle Visitors, but it is about how it's a transformative experience, and it's somehow about, as we say, preparing humans or us for weird changes or opening us to certain possibilities in consciousness. And that's why I think it blends over into this wider realm of whatever you want to call it, consciousness expansion, mystical experience, paranormal experience. I mean, myself, I kind of think of it as a gradient. I mean, you have, everyday kind of bog standard, normal, reality of things, and then you have a kind of aesthetic or poetic kind of experience which, it's a little bit stranger than this mystical, or whatever you want to call it, psychedelic, and then into these, and they open up into strange sorts of things too. So I mean, fundamentally, I think it is about getting into, or somehow being introduced to these broader areas of our own being and consciousness. And I mean, this is where, like, the way we think about things in this world might not apply in there. So somehow, is it me? Is it them? Is it something else other than me? I mean, Jung, again, when he had his own experiences more than 100 years ago now, when he descended into the unconscious after the breakup with Freud, and he had a whole kind of psychotic episode, look at it that way. He said he encountered these beings that inhabited his mind. They told him that you think you own this space, but you share it with us.
Yeah.
You share it with us, and we're this is like the forest, and it's all different flora and fauna here. It's not so your thoughts are like animals in the forest in a way. That's a weird thing for us to kind of understand.
What is your perception of consciousness?
It's a good thing to have, and I'd like more of it. I think consciousness is one of these things that the more you try to, define it, the more elusive it becomes. Yeah. I mean, you have to use other equally elusive terms. It's awareness, it's self-awareness. I mean, what should I say? I mean, what did Bergson says something about? Consciousness is. Somehow consciousness can draw on more than it contains in some way. So it's open-ended, I would say. And again, that's when we're sort of talking about that now. I mean, we think of different metaphors and different spatial kinds of images in order to try to understand this, even the sense of the unconscious, and the depth of unconscious, and superconsciousness is up there and that kind of thing. But,
but is all this an illusion?
What? No. I'd say I don't like words like illusion and all that, because they come packed with lots of other stuff. And it's like, I would say what we take every day to be conscious is a highly edited, limited version of what's out there and in here at the same time. And that's for evolutionarily adaptive purposes. And this is what Huxley said a long time ago when he took the experiment with mescaline. Was that what happened was that the mescaline had somehow again, it's all metaphors, but they're sort of taps on the amount of reality that's available to consciousness, and most of the time it's only a thin trickle that we have. It's just what we need to be able to deal with things. But when you take the drug, mescaline, or any number of drugs, even Wally, what it does is opens those taps a little bit more reality comes in. And suddenly it's like, ooh, something that, you thought you knew everything about appears strange and weird and all that. So consciousness sort of filters out what for survival purposes is considered unnecessary. But it does, again, it's one of these things that does this job too well. That's why it's all trial. I'm an evolutionist. It's all trial and error. I'm a what do you say, creative evolutionist. I'm not a Darwinian evolutionist. I think there's some intelligence in some way behind it. It has purposes and aims, but it learns as it goes along. So it's not all laid out in some plan like that. And so, just like the robot is necessary, but it develops kinks and problems as it goes along. Consciousness is necessary. There's this cutting out element of consciousness. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, said the brain serves an eliminative function. Its function is to eliminate 99% of all the stimuli coming in. And then when you take the drug or drink, it sort of cuts that off, and like lots of stuff comes in. But the problem with that is that your will is inhibited. You can't. Huxley said he didn't want to wash the dishes in the sink because they were too beautiful.
Yeah.
Mrs. Huxley had to wash. So we're kind of caught between the two. You have the workaholic who did it all the time, and it's no fun, and then like that. But everything is just Again, it's an evolutionary problem to solve, and I have enough optimism to think that at some point we will, if we don't, destroy ourselves through climate change or something else in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, I have just one more. I have just one more question left, but have you got any more, John?
No, we'll cut this one a bit short. We normally go 2 hours, and it nearly killed us last time.
I can't. I'm getting dry mouth now. So
this has been fantastic. So you go for the last question, mate.
Yeah. So unknowns. You write in your book, Politics of the Occult, that unknown superiors are a sign of the occult and politics together. The term invisible college is a term that comes up time and time again today, but particularly within the UFO field. Do you think that ancient mystical techniques exist today amongst the powerful of the world?
Well, if they do. They're certainly not going to tell us they do. So, it depends what you mean by that, but I don't know. I don't think, there's some kind of, actual super source of powers, that some people have access to. And I do think the sort of...
Remember that shape when you're watching the politicians in your political book.
Well, I don't know. I'm an optimist. There's all. What is Trump doing when he's doing that? I know that's a kind of orator's routine. When you sort of remember everything you're going to say, but he's doing all these kind of mudras and things like that. And all. Maybe there are. How would you know? How could you find out?
333 all the time.
It could very well be. But if there are powers to use to protect ourselves and to do more. To advance the good, not only to defend it against the advance of evil, but to promote the good that it accelerates and
well, that's a much more pleasant note to leave this on than the climate disaster.
Absolutely.
So.